I found a rare spaceship at auction. Unfortunately, it's about to be dismantled. While other kids played video games or collected baseball cards, Daniel collected books and magazines about rockets, satellites, and space missions. He memorized the names of astronauts and their missions, from Mercury and Gemini to Apollo and the Space Shuttle program. Space was not just a hobby for him, it was a passion that shaped his dreams and guided his life choices. Now, in his late 20s, Daniel worked as a mechanical engineer. His job was steady, but it didn't offer the thrill he craved. He loved his work with machines, gears, and engines, but he often found himself daydreaming about the bigger machines of all: rockets, spacecraft, and test modules. Every evening, after long hours at the office, he would browse through online auction sites and government surplus listings. It wasn't unusual for him to spend hours scrolling through pages of old industrial equipment, hoping to find something interesting or historically significant. Most of the time, he found nothing more than scrap metal, old machines, or broken electronics. But one night, as he was going through a particularly obscure surplus website, something caught his eye. It was a listing buried deep among 1,000 others. The title was simple, almost dismissive: Experimental Crew Module Prototype, Non-Flight Scrap Value. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He had seen pictures of crew modules before, but the shape in these photos looked very familiar. It reminded him of the early test hardware used by NASA after the shuttle era, before the newer spacecraft like Orion were developed. The module in the photo looked like it had a history, a story that had been forgotten. The metal was scratched and faded, and the photos were grainy and poorly lit, but to Daniel it was unmistakable. He clicked on the listing, reading every word carefully. It mentioned a weight of 12 tons, stored in a contractor yard and scheduled for dismantling if no buyer was found. The description was simple, almost indifferent, but Daniel could see through it. This wasn't just scrap. This was a piece of aerospace history that had somehow slipped through the cracks. Daniel's mind raced. How had such an important artifact ended up here, listed as scrap? He began researching immediately. Using old NASA reports, aerospace contractor records, and online forums, he tried to trace the history of the module. It took hours of digging, but he eventually confirmed that this was indeed a structural test article from the early years of post-shuttle spacecraft development. It had never flown, never been displayed in a museum, and had been stored at various contractors' facilities before ending up in this yard. The more Daniel learned, the more urgent it felt. The auction description clearly stated that the module was slated to be dismantled for its metal. If no one acted quickly, it would be gone forever. For most people, it was just another industrial relic. For Daniel, it was history about to vanish. He paced his apartment, thinking through the possibilities. Could he really buy it? He was just an engineer with a regular salary, not a wealthy collector or a museum director. The cost alone would be enormous. He would need to pay for transport, storage, and eventual preservation, and there was no guarantee that anyone would help him. Museums were often underfunded and selective about what they could accept, but Daniel couldn't ignore it. He imagined the module being cut into pieces, its panels stripped, and its metal melted down. The thought made him feel like a guardian standing at the edge of a cliff, watching a priceless artifact teetering on the brink of destruction. He knew that if he didn't act, no one else might. The next morning, Daniel called the auction house. He asked detailed questions about the module's dimensions, weight, and current condition. The auction manager was blunt and practical. "It's scrap," he said. "No one wants it as a display. The contractor wants to clear space. If you don't take it, it will be dismantled." Daniel thanked him and hung up. That was all the confirmation he needed. He began calculating the logistics. Moving a 12-ton spacecraft module was no small task. He would need cranes, a flatbed trailer, special permits, and possibly professional movers. And the auction itself was just days away. Time was against him. For the next week, Daniel prepared everything he could. He reached out to friends who had experience with large equipment transport. He contacted local authorities to inquire about permits. He even sketched diagrams of how the module could be moved safely from the contractor yard to temporary storage. Each step required precision, planning, and problem-solving, the very skills he had honed as an engineer. As the auction day approached, Daniel felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. He had participated in auctions before, but never for something like this. The thought of losing the module to dismantling kept him awake at night. He imagined standing in the yard, seeing the module covered in tarps, the metal glinting in the sun, knowing it could disappear within hours. Finally, the day arrived. Daniel drove 600 miles to the auction site, his mind buzzing with anticipation. The yard was industrial and unremarkable, filled with discarded machinery and scrap piles. Among them, partially hidden under a heavy tarp, sat the crew module. It was larger in person than he had imagined, and its presence was both humbling and thrilling. He inspected it carefully. The metal was scratched and weathered, the panels marked with numbers and letters from its testing days. Some areas showed signs of corrosion, and a few pieces were slightly bent or dented. It had clearly been through rough handling over the years. Yet, despite its condition, Daniel could feel the weight of history in every rivet and seam. This module had been part of experiments that contributed to human spaceflight. It was a silent witness to years of innovation and effort. The auction manager walked him through the process. "You need to place your bid now," he said. "If you win, you have 30 days to remove it, or the contractor will dismantle it." Daniel took a deep breath. He knew that winning the bid meant committing not just money, but time, energy, and possibly years of effort. But he also knew that losing it meant watching history be destroyed. With a steady hand and a determined heart, he placed his bid. Hours later, the results came in. Daniel had won. The module was his. Relief and excitement washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by the realization of the work ahead. Moving a 12-ton spacecraft was no small task, and he had only 30 days before the dismantling deadline. That night, Daniel sat in his small apartment, staring at the photos of the module on his laptop. He couldn't help but smile. Against all odds, he had rescued a piece of history, but the journey had just begun. He would need to navigate logistics, transportation, and eventual preservation. There would be challenges, unexpected costs, and setbacks. Yet, despite the obstacles, he felt a sense of purpose he had never felt before. For Daniel, this was more than a purchase. It was a mission, a responsibility, and a chance to ensure that an important part of aerospace history survived for future generations. The adventure had begun with a simple online listing, but it had grown into a journey that would test his skills, his patience, and his dedication. In the quiet of his apartment, Daniel whispered to himself, "I won't let it be destroyed." "Not on my watch." The words were more than a promise, they were a declaration. This crew module, nearly forgotten and destined for scrap, now had a chance to be preserved, remembered, and celebrated. And Daniel knew that he would do everything in his power to make that happen. Daniel woke up the next morning with a mixture of excitement and nerves. Winning the auction had been the first step, but now came the real challenge: retrieving the module from the contractor yard and moving it to a safe location. He knew that this would be more difficult than anything he had done before. Moving a spacecraft module wasn't like moving furniture or even heavy machinery. It was large, fragile in certain areas, and had immense historical value. A single mistake could damage it irreparably. He packed his laptop, notebooks, and all the sketches he had made during the week. His plan was to spend the day at the yard, inspecting the module in person, measuring dimensions accurately, and figuring out how to lift and transport it safely. Daniel drove 600 miles with a careful sense of purpose. Each mile brought him closer to the object he had been dreaming about for months. Along the way, he reviewed his notes repeatedly, calculating weights, crane requirements, and trailer specifications. He imagined every possible obstacle, from uneven ground to limited crane access, and tried to plan around them. When he finally arrived, the industrial yard looked larger than it had in the photos. Piles of metal, old machinery, and tarps covered items of every shape and size. And there it was, partially covered by a gray tarp, sitting alone in a corner. Despite the dust, scratches, and dents, Daniel felt a thrill he had never experienced before. The module was more impressive than he had imagined. Its metal surface reflected the sun in dull glints, and the faded markings from testing gave it an aura of authenticity and history. Daniel approached carefully, trying not to step on uneven ground or dislodge loose debris. He ran his hands over the panels, feeling the cold metal and the small rivets that held the structure together. The module felt solid and heavy, yet strangely delicate, like it was carrying the weight of all the engineers, scientists, and technicians who had worked on it decades ago. Every scratch and dent seemed to tell a story, a silent reminder of the experiments, tests, and trials it had endured. The auction manager met him at the site. "You've got 30 days to remove it," he said bluntly. "After that, the contractor will start dismantling." "We don't have storage space beyond that," Daniel nodded. "I understand. I'll make it happen." He didn't tell the manager how complex the process would be, or that he had only a rough plan for moving the massive structure. For Daniel, the mission was personal. He couldn't let anyone else touch the module until it was safe. He spent the next several hours measuring every dimension of the module. Length, width, height, distance from the ground to lifting points. He recorded everything meticulously. He photographed every panel, every seam, every marking. He even noted weak areas that might need reinforcement during transport. He wanted a complete record, both for logistical reasons and for historical documentation. If something went wrong, at least he would have a detailed record of the module's condition before moving it. Next, Daniel called friends who had experience with large equipment. He needed cranes, straps, a flatbed trailer, and a team to help maneuver the module without damaging it. Most friends were skeptical. "A spacecraft? Are you serious?" one of them asked. "That thing weighs 12 tons. Do you even have the money or space to store it?" Daniel explained carefully, emphasizing that the module was fragile and historically important. He didn't mention the entire auction price, only that he had to move it safely. Slowly, a small team of volunteers agreed to help. They were engineers, hobbyists, and space enthusiasts, people who shared Daniel's fascination with space and history. Over the next week, Daniel coordinated with a local crane rental company and arranged for a flatbed trailer capable of carrying the weight. He secured permits for transporting an oversized load on public roads. Each call and email was a reminder of how complicated the operation would be. Moving the module wasn't just lifting it. It required coordination with authorities, precise planning, and a bit of luck. On the day of the lift, the yard was alive with activity. Cranes were positioned carefully, straps hung in precise locations, and Daniel's small team worked like clockwork. He had prepared them for weeks, rehearsing each step mentally so they could execute it perfectly. When the crane lifted the module off the ground, Daniel held his breath. The metal creaked slightly, but held firm. Every movement had to be slow and deliberate. A sudden jolt could damage a panel or bend a structural frame. Once the module was safely on the trailer, Daniel surveyed it again. It looked almost unchanged from when he had first seen it, but now it was mobile, on its way to a new life. The journey to storage would be another test. Public roads, bridges, and uneven terrain all posed risks, but Daniel drove slowly, frequently stopping to check the module and adjust straps. It was exhausting work, but the satisfaction of seeing the module move safely was immense. After several days of careful driving, planning, and small adjustments, the module finally reached a rented storage facility. It wasn't a museum, not yet, but it was safe. Daniel could finally breathe, at least temporarily. He spent hours documenting its placement, inspecting panels, and taking detailed photographs. He even began a journal, recording every step of the rescue operation, so that anyone who followed later could understand what had been done and why. But moving the module was only the beginning. Daniel knew that restoring it would be far more complex. Years of neglect had left corrosion, dust, and minor structural damage. Some panels had been removed and replaced over the years, leaving gaps that needed to be studied carefully. Daniel began researching its lineage again, contacting former aerospace contractors and engineers who had worked on post-shuttle spacecraft programs. They confirmed what he suspected. This module had been part of early structural tests, experiments that were crucial to the development of later spacecraft, including Orion. Learning this only strengthened Daniel's resolve. The module was not just metal and rivets. It was a symbol of a critical period in human spaceflight. It represented the work of hundreds of engineers and technicians who had contributed to humanity's journey into space, and it had nearly been lost forever. Daniel decided to reach out to museums, science centers, and universities. He wanted to find a permanent home for the module, a place where people could see it, learn from it, and be inspired by it. Unfortunately, responses were discouraging. Museums cited limited funding, space constraints, and bureaucratic hurdles. Universities were intrigued but lacked the resources to transport and display such a massive artifact. Despite setbacks, Daniel continued to work. He cleaned corrosion, stabilized weak panels, and meticulously labeled every piece that had been removed during previous tests. He studied old documents, photographs, and engineering drawings to understand exactly how the module had been built and tested. Every weekend, he devoted hours to preservation. What began as a rescue mission had turned into a personal journey, a mission to preserve history. Months passed. Daniel's weekends were consumed by the module. Friends who had helped in the initial lift continued to volunteer, drawn by his passion and dedication. He began photographing each panel, marking serial numbers, and documenting the test modifications. He even contacted aerospace historians, sharing what he had found. They were amazed. Few people realized that such a module still existed, hidden in a contractor yard and at risk of being destroyed. Daniel's work drew attention online as well. Space enthusiasts and historians reached out, offering advice, technical information, and encouragement. His story became a symbol of how easily history can be lost when programs end and budgets shift. The module, which had once been almost forgotten, was now slowly gaining recognition. Through it all, Daniel faced personal sacrifices. He spent long hours away from family and friends. He depleted much of his savings to cover storage, transport, and restoration costs. But he didn't regret a single moment. Each scratch he cleaned, each rivet he documented, and each panel he stabilized was a step towards saving history. By the end of the year, the module had been moved, stabilized, and partially restored. Daniel had a clear record of its condition, history, and modifications. He had connected with experts, historians, and enthusiasts who shared his passion. And while the module was not yet in a museum, it was safe, preserved, and ready for its next chapter. Looking back, Daniel realized that the auction listing that had seemed insignificant was actually the beginning of an incredible journey. What had started as a simple discovery in a surplus catalog had turned into a mission to rescue, preserve, and honor a piece of human history. It was a reminder that sometimes history survives not because of institutions or organizations, but because one person cares enough to act before it's too late. Daniel often stood in the storage facility late at night, looking at the module. He imagined the engineers and astronauts who had worked on programs like Orion and the Space Shuttle. He thought about the experiments, tests, and countless hours of dedication that had gone into this object, and he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Against the odds, he had saved something important, but he also knew this was only the beginning. The journey to ensure the module's permanent preservation and public display was far from over. There would be more challenges, more obstacles, and more work, yet Daniel felt ready. The module had already taught him lessons about patience, perseverance, and the value of history. As he turned off the lights and left the storage facility for the night, Daniel whispered to himself, "You're safe now, and I won't let you be forgotten." The words were more than reassurance, they were a promise. The journey was not over, but the first victory had been won. Daniel Mercer had finally secured the module in his rented storage facility. For weeks, he had breathed a sense of relief that it was no longer at risk of being dismantled for scrap. But the real work was just beginning. Moving it had been one challenge, but preserving it for the long term required patience, research, and careful effort. He knew that even small mistakes could damage the structure or erase valuable historical information. He started by inspecting every inch of the module again, this time with restoration in mind. Dust, dirt, and rust had accumulated over the years, especially around rivets and panel edges. Some panels were slightly bent, and certain areas had corrosion that needed to be carefully cleaned. Daniel remembered advice he had read in aerospace restoration guides. Preserve, don't replace unless absolutely necessary. That would be his guiding principle. Daniel set up a workspace in one corner of the storage unit. He laid out tools, brushes, soft cloths, and cleaning solutions. Every weekend, he dedicated hours to gently cleaning surfaces, removing rust without damaging the metal underneath. It was tedious work. There were times when his hands ached, his back hurt, and the process seemed never-ending. Yet, as each panel became cleaner and more stable, Daniel felt a sense of accomplishment. The module began to look more like the spacecraft it had once been, and less like a forgotten heap of metal. While physical restoration was ongoing, Daniel realized he needed to understand the module's history in more detail. Its origins were partially documented, but there were gaps. Who had built it exactly? What tests had it undergone? How had it contributed to the design of later spacecraft? He began reaching out to former aerospace contractors, engineers, and technicians who had been involved in post-shuttle programs. He was careful in his approach. Many of the engineers had retired or moved on to other fields. Some remembered the module vaguely, others had no idea it still existed. But Daniel was persistent. He explained his mission, that the module had been rescued from destruction and he wanted to preserve it for educational and historical purposes. Slowly, he pieced together fragments of information. The module had been part of structural load testing, a critical step in developing crewed spacecraft capable of deep space missions. It had never flown, but it had been essential in ensuring that future spacecraft could withstand stress, vibrations, and the extreme conditions of space travel. Each conversation with engineers brought new insight and renewed motivation. Daniel learned that small changes in materials, panel thickness, and structural design had been tested on this module. It was essentially a bridge between the retired space shuttle program and new spacecraft like Orion. The module might never have left the ground, but it had shaped the future of human spaceflight. With this knowledge, Daniel began documenting everything meticulously. He labeled each panel, recording serial numbers, test marks, and unique features. He photographed damaged areas and noted possible causes. His goal was to create a complete historical record. If the module were eventually displayed in a museum, future generations could understand its journey and significance. Daniel also faced practical challenges. Some panels had been removed and stored separately over the years, and a few were missing. He had to reconstruct the missing pieces using old engineering drawings, photographs, and advice from engineers who remembered the testing process. It was a delicate balance, restoring enough to preserve the module's integrity without altering its original condition. Despite the technical challenges, Daniel found moments of pure joy. He remembered reading about astronauts touching spacecraft before flight, about engineers taking pride in the machines they built. Now, as he gently cleaned a panel or tightened a loose rivet, he felt a connection to the people who had worked on it decades ago. It was as if he were bridging time, linking their efforts to the present. Months passed. Restoration progressed slowly but steadily. Daniel found that he enjoyed the rhythm of it, cleaning, documenting, and researching. He learned to recognize different alloys, composite materials, and test modifications. Even small discoveries, like a faded stamp indicating a manufacturer or a test date, felt like uncovering hidden treasure. During this time, Daniel began sharing his progress online. He created a blog and posted photos, descriptions, and stories about the module's history. Space enthusiasts and historians from around the world began to follow his updates. Some offered technical advice, others provided historical context, and a few even shared old photographs of similar modules. The response encouraged Daniel to continue, knowing that his work was appreciated and had educational value. The module also drew attention from regional museums and educational institutions. While most were unable to accept such a large artifact, a few showed interest in collaborating. Daniel began building relationships with curators, explaining the module's significance and providing detailed documentation. He understood that public display was the ultimate goal, but he also knew that it might take years to secure a permanent home. One day, an engineer who had worked on structural tests decades earlier visited Daniel. He spent hours examining the module, pointing out subtle modifications and test reinforcements that had been added for safety purposes. The engineer shared stories about the testing process, how the module had been placed in hydraulic simulators, how stress measurements were recorded, and how even minor design changes could affect the safety of astronauts in future missions. Daniel listened, fascinated, absorbing every detail. For him, this was more than restoration, it was history coming to life. Daniel also faced unexpected challenges. Some panels had sustained minor corrosion that could not be fully removed without risking damage. Certain bolts were rusted and would not loosen without specialized tools. Transporting the module to a potential museum remained a logistical challenge due to its size and weight. Each step required careful problem-solving and sometimes creative solutions. Yet he refused to give up. He reminded himself of the auction day, of how close the module had come to being destroyed, and of the responsibility he now carried. Even as he worked, Daniel reflected on the human aspect of this mission. The engineers, technicians, and contractors who had contributed to the module's creation had often worked without public recognition. The module itself had been nearly forgotten, deemed scrap by those outside the aerospace community. Daniel's efforts were not just about preserving a machine, they were about honoring the people and their dedication. He realized that history is fragile, and without someone to care for it, even important achievements can disappear. As the months turned into a year, Daniel achieved significant progress. The module was cleaned, stabilized, and documented in detail. Its story was being pieced together through research, interviews, and engineering records. Daniel had created a comprehensive archive that included photographs, drawings, and personal accounts from engineers who had worked on the post-shuttle programs. Despite all this, Daniel knew that more work lay ahead. The module still needed to be transported to a public institution, ideally a museum or science center, where it could be properly displayed. Funding remained uncertain, and the logistics of moving such a massive artifact were daunting. But Daniel felt confident that he could overcome these obstacles. His passion, dedication, and careful planning had brought him this far, and he would not stop now. During quiet evenings in the storage facility, Daniel would sometimes sit on a folding chair and look at the module. The metal panels reflected the soft light, revealing scratches, rivets, and faded markings that had survived decades of neglect. He imagined the engineers who had designed, built, and tested it, and felt a deep sense of connection to their work. For Daniel, the module was more than a machine. It was a symbol of human curiosity, ingenuity, and perseverance. As he closed his notebook and turned off the lights, Daniel felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had rescued the module, preserved its history, and begun the long process of restoring it to its former glory. He had connected with experts, enthusiasts, and historians who shared his passion. And while the module was not yet in a museum, it was safe, stable, and ready for the next stage of its journey. Daniel knew that the path ahead would be challenging. Moving the module, securing funding, and finding a permanent home were all uncertain. Yet he felt hopeful. The work he had done so far had demonstrated that dedication and care could save history from being lost. And he understood that sometimes, preserving the past requires more than money or authority. It requires someone willing to act when others do not. The module, once almost forgotten and destined for scrap, now had a second chance, and Daniel was determined to see it through. He whispered softly to himself as he left the storage facility that night, "You've survived this far, and I won't let you fade away. Your story will be told." Daniel Mercer had spent more than a year carefully cleaning, documenting, and partially restoring the module. Each panel, each rivet, each faded marking had been recorded. He had interviewed engineers, researched old documents, and pieced together the module's story. It had survived neglect, the threat of dismantling, and years of storage in a dusty yard. Now the final challenge remained, finding a permanent home where the module could be appreciated, preserved, and shared with the public. At first, the task seemed impossible. Museums were often limited by space and funding, and the module was enormous, weighing 12 tons and spanning several meters in length. Universities and science centers were intrigued but could not accommodate such a massive artifact. Daniel began to feel the weight of frustration. He had rescued the module from destruction, painstakingly restored it, and yet it seemed destined to remain hidden in a storage facility. Despite the setbacks, Daniel refused to give up. He expanded his outreach, contacting regional museums, aerospace foundations, and historical societies. He prepared detailed presentations, including photographs, diagrams, and a complete history of the module. He emphasized not just its technical significance, but its human story, the engineers and technicians who had designed it, the tests it had endured, and the fact that it had almost been destroyed. Finally, a breakthrough came. A regional aerospace museum, planning an exhibit on the post-shuttle era and the transition to new deep space programs, expressed interest. The curator had seen Daniel's online documentation and was impressed by the depth of his research and the module's historical importance. They arranged a meeting at the storage facility. When Daniel met the curator, he showed every detail he had collected, photographs, engineering notes, and panels that had been carefully preserved. The curator ran her hands over the module's surface, pointing out subtle features she had never seen in other artifacts. "This is extraordinary," she said. "It tells a story few people know about, the bridge between the shuttle program and modern spacecraft. This module deserves to be displayed." The museum agreed to accept the module on a long-term loan. However, transporting it to the museum would be another monumental task. Daniel began coordinating logistics with the museum's staff, transportation experts, and local authorities. Cranes, heavy-duty trailers, and special permits were all required. Every detail had to be planned carefully. The module could not be damaged during the move. For weeks, Daniel and the team rehearsed the move. They measured every dimension, reinforced fragile panels, and mapped out the route to avoid low bridges and narrow roads. It was a delicate operation, requiring precision and patience. Daniel could feel the excitement building. The module he had rescued from near destruction was finally about to reach a public home. On the day of the move, Daniel arrived at the storage facility early. The crane was positioned precisely, and the module was slowly lifted from its resting place. The team moved cautiously, communicating constantly. Daniel held his breath as the module swayed slightly in the straps. Every second felt critical. Finally, it was secured on the flatbed trailer. The journey to the museum had begun. The transport was slow and careful. Daniel rode alongside the module, checking straps and monitoring stability. People on the streets stopped to stare at the enormous spacecraft being carefully transported through the city. It was a surreal moment for Daniel. What had once been a forgotten scrap item was now drawing attention, even admiration from passers-by. When the module arrived at the museum, the team carefully unloaded it using cranes and reinforced supports. Daniel inspected it closely. Despite the long journey, it was intact. The museum staff helped position it in the exhibit space, ensuring it would be visible to the public while also protected from damage. Finally, after months of preparation, the module was ready to be displayed. The unveiling ceremony was modest but meaningful. Engineers who had worked on the module, museum staff, and space enthusiasts attended. Daniel stood quietly to the side, watching as visitors approached the module, reading the plaques that described its history, significance, and near destruction. Children pressed their hands to the protective barriers, staring in awe at the massive metal structure that had once been at the center of important space tests. Daniel listened to the stories visitors shared as they explored the exhibit. Many expressed surprise that such an artifact had almost been lost to scrap. Others spoke of inspiration, imagining the engineers and astronauts who had dedicated their lives to space exploration. Daniel felt a quiet satisfaction. His long months of effort, research, and care had ensured that the module's story would be remembered. In the following weeks, the museum invited local schools and educational groups to visit the exhibit. Daniel volunteered to guide tour, explaining the module's history and the importance of preserving aerospace artifacts. He spoke to students about engineering challenges, problem-solving, and the human stories behind technology. Watching young minds light up with curiosity, Daniel realized that the module had become more than just a machine. It was a tool for inspiration, education, and discovery. The module also drew attention from historians and space enthusiasts worldwide. Daniel received messages from people who had worked on similar projects, sharing memories, photographs, and technical details. He incorporated their input into the exhibit, enhancing the historical record and creating a more complete story for future generations. As the months passed, Daniel reflected on the journey. The module had started as a forgotten object in a contractor yard, almost destined for destruction. Through dedication, research, and careful effort, it had been preserved and transformed into a public exhibit. Daniel had faced logistical challenges, financial strain, and moments of doubt, yet he had persevered. He realized that preserving history often requires not just passion, but persistence, patience, and courage. He also understood the personal growth that had come from the experience. The project had tested his engineering skills, problem-solving abilities, and organizational capacity. It had deepened his understanding of aerospace history and strengthened his connection to the people who had contributed to it. Most importantly, it had reinforced a principle that Daniel had come to cherish. That one person can make a difference in preserving history. The module now stood proudly in the museum, a symbol of resilience, innovation, and human curiosity. It was no longer scrap. It was an artifact that told a story of transition, experimentation, and dedication. Visitors could see the panels, rivets, and markings that had once been almost lost. They could learn about the engineers and technicians who had worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure the safety and success of future space missions. Daniel often returned to the exhibit, quietly observing visitors as they explored the module. He saw children inspired to ask questions, students discussing engineering concepts, and adults reflecting on the history of space exploration. In those moments, Daniel felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His efforts had ensured that the module's story would endure, educating and inspiring generations to come. At night, after the museum closed, Daniel would sometimes stand near the module, thinking back to the day he discovered it online. What had seemed like a simple auction listing had transformed into a mission that shaped his life. The journey had been long and challenging, but it had been worth every sacrifice. The module had survived because he had acted, and its story would now be told. Daniel realized that history is fragile, and preserving it often requires courage and dedication. The module had almost been lost to indifference, but it now stood as a testament to human curiosity, innovation, and resilience. It reminded him, and everyone who saw it, that even the smallest actions, driven by care and determination, can make a lasting difference. In the end, Daniel felt a profound sense of peace. The module was safe, its history preserved, and its future secure. He had given it a second life, and in doing so, had connected past achievements to the present and future generations. It was more than an artifact. It was a story, a legacy, and a symbol of what can happen when someone refuses to let history be forgotten. And so, in a quiet museum filled with light and the hum of visitors, the module stood proudly. Daniel Mercer, the engineer who had discovered it in an auction listing, had ensured that it would never be lost again. The artifact that had once faced dismantling and oblivion now inspired curiosity, education, and wonder. Daniel's journey was complete, but the module's story had only just begun. Visitors would come, students would learn, and engineers would reflect on the history of human space exploration. And Daniel knew that, against all odds, he had played a part in ensuring that a critical piece of that history would survive, remembered and celebrated for generations to come.